Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Bani, uh, for your kind words and for asking me here. It's indeed a privilege to be asked to deliver the ninth P K Gopalakrishnan Memorial Lecture, and it's a pleasure to be on this beautiful campus of yours. And I certainly have every intention of taking up your invitation to come here for a longer stay. I'm sure it's going to be an enjoyable experience. And thank you all, faculty members, students, and others who have made it convenient to be here today. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Lata, daughter of the late Dr. Gopalakrishnan, and her friend Dr. Radha for gracing this occasion here, both of them distinguished scientists in their own right. I take this opportunity to salute the memory of Dr. Gopalakrishnan, one of Kerala's distinguished bureaucrats, as Professor Mani just mentioned. Bureaucrats, or babus as they are called derisively today, are not held in particularly high esteem these days. But there are bureaucrats and bureaucrats. And some have served the nation with great distinction. Some continue to do so, and Dr. Gopalakrishnan undoubtedly belongs to this superior tradition. As Professor Mani mentioned, he rose to become member secretary of the Kerala State Planning Board, but he is best remembered here as the founder of many quality institutions, including scientific and technical laboratories. And of course, he was one of the moving spirits behind the Center for Development Studies. So those of you who are students of economics would know the relationship between institutions and growth. We are beholden to the founding fathers of this nation for the many great institutions that were set up in the decades in the past. And we still need institutions of this kind. And therefore, we are beholden to men like Dr. Gopalakrishnan for having set up institutions such as the Center for Development Studies. The subject of my talk today, as Professor Mani correctly mentioned, is a highly topical one. I'm going to talk about India's banking crisis in perspective and the way this talk is structured. So I will talk first about banking crisis in general and their broad characteristics. Then I move on to India's banking crisis, still under resolution and its possible resolution. Then I come to what is in many ways the meat of this talk, which is the future of public sector banks, the subject of huge policy debate in recent months, especially in the context of 50 years of bank nationalization. And then I will put forward some tentative conclusions and propositions for your consideration. So let me start off with banking crisis and their characteristics. One of the things to know about banking is that as a sector, it is habitually prone to crisis. It's almost as if banks are programmed to fail. It is in the very DNA of banks to fail. And when banks collectively fail, you have a sectoral crisis which creates havoc for the larger economy. What sort of havoc it creates, I will document very shortly. There's a classic study by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, which documents banking crisis going back to 1800. And the numbers in brackets are the references which come at the end of this presentation. So UK, US, and France have had 12, 13, and 15 episodes of banking crisis since 1800. So not just the occasional crisis, but repeated bouts of banking crisis. And these are among the most developed economies of the world. And the average time taken to come out of a banking crisis, the two authors have computed, and to reach the pre-crisis level of income is as long as 8 years. So it's a bad idea to get into a banking crisis. Coming out of it is very difficult. We are experiencing it right now. And what are the characteristics of a banking crisis? You have large bank losses, you have multiple bank liquidations, You have significant policy interventions, and there are some indicators of a banking crisis which academics have formulated. For instance, if there is a gross restructuring cost which is over 3% of GDP, then that qualifies as a serious banking crisis. You have significant bank nationalization, extensive bank guarantees. And the sufficient condition for a crisis to be regarded as systemic is that the banking system losses should exceed 20% of loans, or the fiscal restructuring cost should exceed 5% of GDP. Do you think the Indian banking crisis meets either of these two conditions today? What do you think? Based on whatever you've been reading about, is the cost anywhere as high as this? Not at all. Much more modest. So we should be thanking our stars that the crisis is not what we call a classical banking crisis. It's a much more mild, it's a much milder form of crisis that we are experiencing. And that's all to the good, because when a banking crisis does happen, the costs, as I mentioned earlier, are extremely high. So you can measure the costs of banking crisis in various ways, and the rough and ready measure which most people use is to look at the direct fiscal cost. How much is it costing the government to bail out the banking system? But the more rigorous way to look at the banking crisis cost is to look at the output loss for the economy, measured as deviation of GDP from output trend over a specified period. So the output goes away from the median trend and for a very long period. And this cumulative output loss to the economy is really the substantive cost of a banking crisis. There's another measure which academics use, which is to look at the increase in public debt over a specified period, starting from the first year of the crisis. So governments try to bail out the banking system, governments have to borrow. As a result, the public debt of the government goes up. Now, in many of these studies, when they talk about the crisis, the period is specified. They look at the cost for 3 or 4 years. And you will immediately understand that this is going to understate the cost. Because the true cost is when the economy comes back to the trend rate of growth. If we just use 3 or 4 years, and in 3 or 4 years it's unlikely to come back to the trend rate, you're going to be understating the cost. So you have to remember that when you look at many of these academic studies, they are systematically understating the cost of a banking crisis. The more rigorous specification, as I mentioned here, is to look at the entire period taken to return to the pre-crisis growth path. So let us look at some of the estimates of a banking crisis subject to the qualifications that I mentioned. And the famous one is an IMS study done by Levin in Valencia. They looked at 147 episodes of banking crisis in 115 economies in the period 1970 to 2011. So in 31 years, 147 episodes of banking crisis, an average of about 5 episodes in any given year, in some part of the world or the other. Some of these may be very small economies, so you don't get to hearing about them. Sometimes the effects are confined to the national economy. It's not a global financial crisis. So again, you don't hear about it. But the crisis, the frequency of these crises is very real. So here are the costs. And can you see the numbers at the back? Or is it being obscured by the lights? Can you read the numbers? Yeah, I think you have to, for a minute, if you can dim a couple of lights. And show them here. Can you see them now at the back? You can't. When the lights were off, I could see them in the morning. Maybe for a minute, because I think it's important to see the numbers. You get an idea of the havoc created by a banking crisis. Yeah. Is it a little better now? Can you? Okay. Anyway, I'll read out the numbers. So 3 measures we are using: the output loss to the economy, the increase in public debt, and the fiscal cost. So for all economies, output over an arbitrary period, so I think these people looked at 3 or 4 years, 23% of GDP is the output loss. The fiscal cost is 6.8% of GDP. And if you look at emerging economies, 26% output loss and a much higher fiscal cost. So keep this number in mind, keep it at the back of your mind, we will come back to it later. The fiscal cost in a typical emerging economy is, the median fiscal cost is 10% of GDP. So there is another study by a couple of other authors, Honohan and Klingbeil, and they estimate the fiscal cost for 40 economies. Average fiscal cost is 12.8% compared to what these guys estimated as 6.8. So depending upon the study, depending upon the period you look at, depending upon the number of years you're looking at, the estimates of cost can vary. There's a study by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which estimates, in my view, which estimates the cost more accurately. The net present value of output loss, so you take the output loss, bring it to a net present value terms, comes to 63% of GDP. Staggering, nothing like 20 or 25% as the earlier study showed. And so the annual cost, if you assume a crisis occurs once in 20-25 years, and you take the total as 63, so 63 divided by 20, the annual GDP cost of a banking crisis is something like 3%. And so the way to look at it is that it's worth paying a cost of 3% of GDP as insurance premium to avoid a 5% chance of a banking crisis. Once in 20 years means 5% probability in a given year. To avoid a 5% chance of a banking crisis, it is worth incurring a cost of up to 3% of GDP. Such is the magnitude of the output loss caused by a severe banking crisis. Should not be taken lightly at all. So let's look at the cost of the subprime crisis, which is really one of the most serious ones many years now. So the Congressional Budget Office estimated the output loss at 41 to 100% of GDP, depending on whether the losses are temporary or permanent. The IMF looked at the loss just for 3 years after the subprime crisis. Its estimate was how much? 31% of GDP in 4 years. Lawrence Ball has an estimate for OECD economies to put together, and he estimates that the weighted average loss of output in just 1 year was 9.8% of GDP. So in a banking crisis, 3 things happen. First is that your output potential falls. The second thing is that the actual output deviates from whatever potential you have. And the third significant effect is that the growth rate of the output potential itself slows down. And the last effect is often ignored in many studies, which is why the cost of a banking crisis is underestimated. Now, so 3 ways in which the economy is impacted, and we can relate it to what's happening in India. So the output potential, which was 8 to 8.5%, is now down to something like 7 to 7.5%. We can argue about the exact magnitude, but these are the ballpark numbers. So the output potential is something like 7.5%. The actual output in 2019-20 is going to be considerably less than 7%, according to many people, closer to 6%. So if you look at the output loss over, say, 10 years, so 8.5 was your output potential. Now your output potential is 7.5. 1% of output potential loss, and suppose we assume this stretches over 10 years. What is the cost over 10 years? 10% of GDP. This will be the cost of the Indian banking crisis. What is the output cost estimated for OECD economies in 1 year by Larry Ball? 9.8%, close to 10% of GDP in 1 year. For us, the same cost over something like 10 years. And therefore, I'm saying we have much to be thankful for the kind of banking crisis that which we are seeing now, which is much milder in intensity than the typical banking crisis, and certainly much milder than anything we saw in the subprime crisis. And the reasons for this I will go into shortly. So my conclusions are that ours is not a classical banking crisis. So this is the second part of my, just to go back to the, so we come to the second part, which is India's banking crisis and its resolution. So the key features, not a classical crisis, which means you don't have multiple failures of banks. I had no bank failure actually. And the reason is, of course, that the sovereign stands behind the banks which are dominant, public sector banks. So I doubt that any of you who are depositors with public sector banks saw the figure for NPAs at these banks and decided to pull out your deposits. Has anybody done that? Please raise your hands. You know, matter of some curiosity to me, you know. So you are indifferent. You know, there could be a banking crisis, banking problem. It could be a very severe problem, but your money is safe. And so the bank is not going to fail. So multiple banks are not going to fail, and therefore you will not have a severe banking crisis. This is the point about having public sector banks and sovereign backing for banks. So it's not a severe crisis. What we have seen is a steep rise in non-performing assets, NPAs, commencing in 2011-12. And these numbers, can you see them? Again, we need to. But let me read out the numbers, because the detail is less important than the substantive point. So starting from 2004 and so up to 2011, 10-11, the NPA number started going down. So from 11-12, you can see that the numbers have started going up. NPA started rising from 11-12 onwards, and then reached a peak in 2018. For 2018-19, the number is 9.3. 11 has come down to 9.3. So the beginnings of a resolution. And in the first column, you have the numbers for public sector banks. The situation is much worse. So 14.6 compared to 11 for the banking system as a whole. And you can see here that in one particular year, 2015-16, the number jumped from 4 to 7.5, almost doubling in 1 year. What happened? Was there a sudden banking crisis in that year? Any guesses? What happened in 15-16 for the NPAs to rise sharply in just 1 year? Without ascribing it to particular individuals, well, what the Reserve Bank of India did was to impose what it called the asset quality review, whereby the recognition of non-performing assets became far more stringent. What you did not call an NPA earlier, you are calling in an NPA. So it's not as if some crisis happened in that year, but the cumulative baggage, you started counting it differently because the norms became more stringent. So the NPA started going up. So 11-12 started going up, kept going up till 18-19. Hopefully the mending has started. 18-19, there's a decline. Let's hope that it continues. So what caused this banking crisis in India? And I think, even if I just pose the question to a layman, he or she would have the answer pat. It's because of public sector banks. And why public sector banks? Because public sector banks are corrupt. There's corruption and incompetence. I mean, this is the layman's understanding. You have 66% of assets with the public sector, and most people would associate the public sector with some kind of incompetence and corruption. And when you eyeball the numbers, so most of the newspapers would give you a straight comparison of the situation in public sector banks and private banks, and the situation is something like this. For 1 year, March 2018-19, the public sector banks have I think the one second. I think the numbers are incorrect here. I'll just correct them. So if you look at the no, I think something has happened to the numbers. This is 12.6% NPA And yes, that's correct. So this is not 1.26, it's 12.6, and at private banks 3.7. A chasm separates the two in terms of NPAs. In terms of returns, minus 0.9% at public sector banks, 1.2%. So everybody says, hey, we know where the rot is. Government ownership is the root of the problem, and I intend to sort of critically examine this proposition, which is taken for granted by many people. So you see, according to me, the key factor which explains the difference between public sector banks and private sector banks, the numbers that we saw earlier, non-performing assets, much higher, return negative. The key factor is the kind of exposures which they took, especially to infrastructure and related sectors. So 5 sectors: mining, iron and steel, textiles, infrastructure, which includes power and telecom and aviation. If you look at these 5 crucial sectors, the public sector banks, these 5 sectors accounted for 29% of all advances. And in the private sector, the exposure was only 14% of all advances. Much higher exposure to 5 critical sectors. Now, if you look at the economic boom of 2004-08, it was driven by an investment boom, and that was a private investment boom, and the investment to GDP ratio rose in 4 years by 11 percentage points to 38%. And this investment boom was driven very substantially by public sector lending to the 5 sectors that I mentioned. So, without the lending by public sector banks to these 5 areas, there would have been no investment boom in 2004-08. People keep harping back to that golden era. Oh, what a wonderful time we had. 8.5–9% growth. That was driven by public sector lending to these key areas. Without that, there would have been no economic boom. So the private banks that have done well are the ones that avoided infrastructure wholly or substantially. And the private banks that today face high non-performing assets, they are part of the same consortia as public sector banks. So when you look at the high-profile defaults or defaulters, you will find that 20–25 banks have lent to them. You have public sector banks, private sector banks, and foreign banks. And so how can you say that corruption and incompetence at public sector banks is responsible? Because then you have to say that this is universal and it is to be found among all types of banks. So that clearly cannot be the explanation. The explanation is more what I told you, the kind of exposure that banks took. So if you look at 3 banks, State Bank of India, Public Sector Bank, ICICI Bank and Standard Chartered Bank, here are the NPA to advances ratio for March 2018. 10.8% at SBI, 9.9% at ICICI Bank, hardly any difference. Standard Chartered Bank, a foreign bank, actually has a higher NPA level. So just eyeballing these numbers should tell you that this problem cannot be ascribed to the ownership. Ownership cannot be the difference because you can't see the difference across 3 types of ownership. So the important question for us is, how is infrastructure to be financed? You have a fiscal constraint, which means the government cannot finance infrastructure on its own. Your bond markets are underdeveloped, which means that if the government cannot finance it and the banks cannot finance and the bond markets cannot finance it, then obviously the financing for infrastructure has to come from banks. So the implication is that private investment in infrastructure has to be financed by banks, and public sector banks did exactly that. And therefore the non-performing assets that you're seeing today, the correct way to look at it is to look at it as deferred government funding in infrastructure. I don't have the money for infrastructure, so I ask the public sector banks to lend to infrastructure. Some years down the road, it shows up as higher NPAs, for which the government has to infuse capital into banks. So it is a form of deferred financing of infrastructure. And therefore the NPA problem should be viewed in perspective. You have to make up your mind whether you want infrastructure to grow or not. And if the answer is in the affirmative, which I expect it will be, then there is no escape from the particular sequence that we have followed. So the critical question that arises is whether public sector banks were reckless in lending to infrastructure. And I told you that it is not exclusively a public sector bank problem. Whoever got exposed to infrastructure has got burned. There was a global financial crisis which was not anticipated even by the best of academics in the US or anywhere else in the world. So the cash flows on which the financing happened turned out to be lower than projected. And the important thing is that key sectors were impacted by factors extraneous to management. So mining was impacted by adverse court judgments. Steel was impacted by dumping by China and the absence of reliable fuel linkages. Power and roads, there were delays in land acquisition and environmental clearances. Telecom, cancellation of 2G licenses. So the economic survey of 2016-17 summed up all this by saying the vast bulk of the problem, the NPA problem, has been caused by unexpected changes in the environment, just changes in timetables, exchange rates, and growth assumptions going wrong. So you can't blame it on PSB management, corruption, inefficiency, and so on. Factors extraneous to management are substantially responsible. Now, don't get me wrong. My intention here is not to give a clean sheet to any category of bankers. Corruption is endemic to our system, and it is ubiquitous. What I am saying is that corruption cannot explain the magnitude of this problem. That cannot be the whole of the explanation or even the substantial portion of the explanation. The explanation has to be found elsewhere. So NPA problem is not primarily one of managerial incompetence at public sector banks or corruption. Okay, so we have a problem on our hands. How do we go about resolving it? So we need to recognize NPAs, we need to recapitalize public sector banks, we need to reform public sector bank. So recognition, resolution, recapitalization, reform, 4 R's which the economic survey spelled out. The progress has been slow on all these fronts. Bank recapitalization has been happening, but it has been happening in small doses. So there is a world of difference between giving 70,000 crores to public sector banks at one shot and giving it in 3 installments. If you give it in 3 installments, then each installment covers the losses and there is nothing left to finance additional credit. Whatever capital goes towards provisions. If you give it at one shot, then some of the capital goes towards covering the provisions and some goes towards financing new credit so that the banks can start taking money. This realization has been slow in coming where the government is concerned. So the latest set of announcements by the finance ministry, there have been 5 rounds, today was the 5th round. In these rounds of announcement, they have said that 70,000 crore of bank recapitalization will happen at one go. Unfortunately, this realization comes rather late in the day. The earlier doses of recapitalization have come in grudging installments. That's been part of the problem. Now, so far as resolution of NPAs is concerned, the February 12, 2018 circular of the Reserve Bank of India focused excessively on resolution through the IBC route, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now, the IBC route has got stymied by litigation, and even all the top 12 cases have not been resolved. So you go to the NCLT, it gives a ruling. You go to the NCLT Appellate Tribunal, they give a ruling. You go to the High Court, they give a ruling. You challenge it before the division bench of the High Court, and then you go to the Supreme Court. So the process goes on and on. We know how good our businessmen are at when it comes to using litigation for their purposes. So this is what you're seeing. So the other thing you have to remember about IBC resolution is that it may lead to liquidation of assets rather than restructuring. And when you liquidate the assets, the recovery is very poor. Your hope in getting recovery for banks lies in resolution rather than liquidation. But if you go to IBC, the probability is that more towards liquidation rather than resolution. So what we need by way of resolution is a balance between IBC resolution and bank-led resolution. So where the cases are viable, the bankers should be able to apply their mind and say, okay, I'm writing off 40%, then the project becomes viable, at least my remaining 60% is taken care of. Unfortunately, there are no incentives in the public sector banking system to take this decision. If I don't do anything and allow the case to go to IBC, I'm safe. If I make the fatal mistake of saying I'm writing off 40% for a high profile corporate borrower, God save me. So the CVC, the CBI, everybody, and 5 years after retired, all these fellows will be after me. So there are no incentives. So what the Indian Banks Association has done is to set up a 6-member panel to advise banks on resolution. So you present particular cases to them and they will say, okay. But the thing is, this advisory panel has been very reluctant to take a view on the haircut. They say we will only look at the process that you have followed. Don't ask us to validate the haircut, because the CBI, instead of going after the banks, will come after us. They don't want to do that. And therefore, my suggestion, which I've articulated in various fora, is that Parliament should create an independent loan resolution authority, which will be staffed by chartered accountants, lawyers, bankers, academics, and retired judges. They will have the power to advise banks on resolution. So they're protected by statute. Only then will bank-led resolution move forward. Only then we will get the right balance. Only then we will have adequate recovery. And only then will the entire process of resolution come to an acceptable end. Otherwise, it's going to drag on and on. Fortunately, the RBI's June 2019 circular has rectified the earlier imbalance which was there. There was an excessive tilt towards IBC, and now the balance there's a better balance between bank-led and IBC resolution. I will not go into the details of the latest amendments. Suffice it is to say that if you take a broad view of how banking crises have been resolved, then the answer comes not from NPA resolution, but from growth. And for growth to happen, so banks have to start growing their balance sheets again. And this requires a robust return to credit growth, which requires adequate infusion of capital. So if you look at what happened in the first decade of the 2010, I showed you the numbers which showed the NPAs coming down progressively. This resolution happened through growth, driven by the global boom. Of course, we were able to ride the global boom. But the broader message should not be forgotten. Banking crisis is best resolved through growth rather than taking individual cases and resolving them. That is a part of the answer. It is not the substantive part of the answer. So now I come to the third part of my presentation, which has to do with the very important policy debate. The question is a very simple one. Do we need public sector banks anymore? So in the 50th year of bank nationalization, you had a flood of commentaries. And people said, maybe it was the right idea at that time. So you needed banks which will expand their geographical presence, reach out to underserved segments. But now the time has come to undo bank nationalization. You must have heard this kind of proposition being articulated. I propose to examine this very closely. And the key issues are, so when you decide, if you want to unwind or abbreviate the presence of the public sector in banking, the key questions to be answered are the following. Have public sector banks consistently underperformed private banks? To you, the answer may seem obvious, and I propose to suggest otherwise. What fiscal costs have public sector banks imposed? Because there's this constant refrain about the drain on the exchequer. So what kind of costs are we talking about? Is privatization desirable or feasible? And lastly, if the answer to number 3 is in the negative, if we don't want to go ahead with privatization, how do we reform public sector banks? So let me take up the first question. Have public sector banks consistently underperformed private banks? So I have a paper which surveys the academic literature on this subject. It looks at the post-reform performance of public sector banks and private banks for a long period, 94-95 to 2010-11, not just my own studies, but the entire academic literature has been surveyed. And the interesting and counterintuitive finding of multiple academic studies is that there was a trend towards convergence in performance of public and private sector banks over the period that I mentioned here, looked at in terms of various measures. If you look at profitability, if you look at the net interest margin, if you look at technical efficiency, various measures have been used. And study after study after study finds a trend towards convergence in that long period which I talked about. And the divergence in performance is happening only in the second half of 2000s for the reason that I told you. Financing of infrastructure, banks which finance infrastructure, banks which didn't. That is the reason for the divergence in performance. Next point. What about the fiscal costs imposed by public sector banks? So I looked at the data for 2008 to 2018-19. Government has infused a total of 3.15 trillion, which is about 1.1% of GDP. What was the median cost of a banking crisis in an emerging economy? I asked you to make a mental note of that number. Does anyone remember? 10%. Yeah. And therefore, 1.1% is below the lower bound of most of those estimates. So whoever talks of public sector banks imposing huge costs on the government is clearly and unequivocally talking through his or her hat. You have not looked at the data on other economies dominated by private banking systems. So among the lowest cost of recapitalization anywhere in the world, so the numbers which I talked about. So the conclusion that I have come to, and many others have come to, is that the fiscal costs of bank failures are ownership neutral, and contrary to popular supposition, the costs are higher in private banking system compared to India's public sector dominated system. Costs are actually much lower in our system. But of course the question remains whether even this 1% of GDP is something that the government can continue to provide for given the fiscal constraint that it is facing. It is modest, it is very low, but does government have the wherewithal to provide even this? That's a different question altogether. We will address that. So my third question on this policy debate on the future of public sector banks is privatization desirable or feasible in light of the facts that I have put forward so far and the data that I presented? And the practical question is, who will be the buyers of public sector banks should you choose to privatize? Now, if you look at the successful private banks, the larger ones that are around today, if you will find that almost all of them have had a semi-government parentage. ICICI Bank was promoted by the government. HDFC Bank was promoted by HDFC Group, which itself was promoted by ICICI, which was promoted by government. Axis Bank was promoted by UTI. So the private banks had a public sector origin and became totally private and professionally managed many years after the operations were stabilized. The private banks which have been set up by professionals, Centurion Bank, Global Trust Bank, if I may add, Yes Bank, not as successful. So the buyer of a public sector bank, you cannot sell these to professionals. The buyer would have to be an industrial house with deep pockets, or it would have to be foreign banks. Now, for good or ill, the regulator today is not favorably disposed towards the entry of industrial houses into banking. Although on paper, the policy is to allow whoever is willing to come in practice, they are extremely wary of allowing industrial houses to come into banking. So those guys can't buy the public sector banks. Foreign banks are allowed to come in through the subsidiary route. They are given all the benefits which domestic banks enjoy, but there are no takers. And this will also be politically very controversial. If you want to sell one of the public sector banks to a foreign bank, it will be politically tricky. So if the industrial house can't buy the public sector banks, and if foreign banks cannot come in large numbers, the alternative is to sell it to foreign institutional investors. Is that a good idea, to sell it to foreign institutional investors? The difficulty we have is that the culture of professionally managed businesses accountable to institutional investors is yet to develop in India. How many firms can you think of, banking or non-banking, which are entirely managed by professionals and are accountable to institutional investors? Can you name 2 or 3, bank or non-bank? It doesn't. HDFC, of course, we know. HDFC Bank. What about non-banks? maybe ITC is one name, Larsen and Toubro, Infosys. How many names can you think of? You'll find it very hard to think of more than 10 such entities, credible entities, where the professionals are running. So this culture has yet to evolve. And so if you can't sell it to an industrial house, if selling it to foreign banks is going to be tricky, and you can't sell it to, give it to professionals, then obviously it is not feasible. The sale of public sector banks is not feasible. It's a theoretical something that people are talking about. And the other thing is that there is no political consensus today in favor of privatization. If anything, the political consensus is against privatization. And this is reflected in the report of the Standing Committee attached to the Ministry of Finance report on stress assets, which came out in August 2018. It's the standing committees are comprised of politicians cutting across party lines. And they have said in that report emphatically that the present NPA problem should not be made an excuse for privatization. So whether you want it or not, on economic grounds, it is not feasible. It is not politically feasible. So what people are talking about is just a theoretical possibility. But I think that some compromise is possible. You can take one or two of the weakest banks, you can try to give them to foreign institutional investors, bring the government shareholding down, and then assess the outcomes. Is it working out or not? Wait and see. Instead of rushing into privatization in a big way, you can try this as an experiment. So that's a compromise that I propose. So if privatization is not the answer to the problems that we have in public sector banks, the practical alternative is to think of reforming public sector banks. And here the PJ Nayak committee, whose report came out in 2014, they made a number of recommendations. They said, you set up a bank investment committee to which all the government shares would be transferred. An independent company run by professionals. Transfer the government shares to them. So this BIC will be manned by professionals and there will be no government representatives. All top appointments will be made by the Bank Investment Committee. The Bank Investment Committee's stake in PSBs would fall below 50%. So the public sector banks would be freed from the purview of CVC, Central Vigilance Commission, and government pay scales. And in the interim, till the Bank Investment Committee is formed, to which all their shares are transferred, constitute a bank's board bureau, again comprising entirely professionals, and they will appoint the chairman, managing directors, and independent directors of public sector banks. What has been the outcome? So these were the grandiose recommendations of the Nayak committee. What has been the outcome? The bank's board bureau has been set up, but it has both RBI and government representatives. Government doesn't want to leave it to professionals. The other steps proposed, Bank Investment Committee and all that, nothing of that sort has happened. So the reality that you have to face is that the government cannot distance itself from top appointments while being accountable to Parliament for the performance of public sector banks. Can you make this pitch to any industrial house saying that you may be the dominant promoter, but you should not appoint the chairman, managing directors, and independent directors? They'll just laugh at you. But this pitch is being made to government. You have to explain to Parliament what is going wrong with the public sector banks, but you should have no say in any of the top appointment. It's a complete non-starter. I never believed in it, and I'm not surprised it has not happened. So you have to understand that the public sector banking model is a composite model, and you can't pick and choose features. You can't say the government should be accountable but should have only 49% ownership. You can't say that government should be the dominant owner with 49%, but you can't make any of the top appointments. You can't say that there should be job security and pension, which goes with public sector banking jobs, but there should be market-linked pay for top management. This is some mishmash that you're talking about. Make up your mind. You want the public sector bank or do you want a private bank? This or that. This, little bit of this and little bit of that, best of both worlds, so to speak, or perhaps the worst of both worlds, is not something that can happen. It hasn't happened. So here again, my proposition, the compromise, is that drop the stakes below 50% in a couple of public sector banks, towards easing the fiscal constraint, continue with the accountability and decision-making powers and see the outcome. Let us see what happens when you take banks out of the system of, above 50% means you are subject to the entire system of checks and balances. You may find them vexatious, but doing away with checks and balances for massive assets which are sitting there in public sector banking is politically and economically very risky. That is why it does not happen. But try it. Try privatization in one or two cases. Try the dropping the stake below. Wait and watch the outcomes. So, in my view, in the foreseeable future, whatever public sector bank reform can happen has to happen within the framework of government ownership. Neither privatization nor the Nayak committee route. We have to face the practical issues. So what can you do and what should be done? Provide enough capital. I think it's happening somewhat belatedly. Make the boards of public sector banks more effective. Have better professionals on the board. Pay a much better fee to the board members. Let the government articulate its position on the board. So you have your representatives, let them participate in the board and contribute. Don't make calls from the ministry to banks. So you are the promoter, you should have your view, express your view at the board meeting. Don't do it behind the scenes. No phone banking, something the Prime Minister has constantly referred to. He ascribes it to the previous dispensation, phone banking. Ensure succession planning and end the game of musical chairs for managing directors and executive directors posts at public sector banks. So you know typically what happens. From Dena Bank to Bank of India to Punjab National Bank. From Syndicate Bank to some slightly bigger bank. So you go as an ED, general manager to ED of a small bank, from ED of a small bank to managing director. So there's no commitment, 2 years, 3 years, 1.5 years term. If you look at the public sector institutions which have done well, State Bank of India or Life Insurance Corporation, the recruitment, the succession planning is entirely from within. Chairman and managing directors, from probationary officer, you rise to the top. And so some such system must be introduced, and I'm happy to mention that this has been mentioned in the latest announcements made by the Honorable Finance Minister. They have given indications that this is going to happen. So avoid delays in the appointments of chairman, managing directors, independent directors. So there's been much debate on bank mergers, and my take on bank mergers is that when you have fewer banks, it is relatively easier for the government to monitor them and to make these appointments. To make appointments for 12 banks is easier than making appointments to 21 banks. So to that extent, to the extent that decision making is expedited, there is something to be said for these mergers. Introduce variable pay at public sector banks in line with policies which already exist at public sector enterprises. I have sat on the board of public sector enterprises. I am very impressed with their variable pay scheme. It is an adequate incentive, but unlike in the private sector, it doesn't verge towards the side of excess. So replicate that at public sector banks. I see no reason why that can't be done. And compensate public sector banks whenever you give them a social mandate. Yes, they have to do Jan Dhan Yojana, but please compensate for that. So the share of public sector banks over the years has fallen to 66% and is expected to fall to 50% in less than a decade. The policy choice that we need to make is whether we need some public sector presence in banking, a strategic presence as I call it. How much presence over what time frame? So should we allow the natural process to happen and 7 to 10 years public sector presence will be down to 50%? Is that okay? Should we abbreviate that process and make it 50% in the next 3 to 4 years by privatizing 1 or 2 banks? Should we abbreviate to the extent of reducing presence to 45 or 30, 40 or 35%? So the choice is between using privatization to expedite this process versus allowing for natural attrition to 50%, but not doing away entirely with public sector presence in banking. And with that, I come to the last portion, which is my conclusions. Let me say conclusions in quotes, tentative conclusions, and as I said, propositions for your consideration. So banking crises are not an aspect of government ownership. They are endemic to private banking systems. Public ownership of banking has imposed lower fiscal costs than elsewhere. Banking can't be left entirely to private auspices because there are significant externalities and implicit government support to banks. So I think when I say strategic presence in banking, what do banks do? Banks are in the business of creating money. Historically, there have been two ways in which money can be created. The time-honored and discredited way was what? Central banks financing the government deficit. This is one way of money creation. The other way is to leave it to private banks to create money. So the first one has been discredited, and I'm sorry to say, the second one has also been discredited after the global crisis. No money creation either exclusively through central bank financing of government deficit or exclusively through private banks. Have quasi-government presence in banking through public sector banks so that some of the money creation happens through government or under government auspices but subject to central bank regulation. So it is not government being free to produce money as it likes, but producing money like private banks subject to the regulatory requirements. So this is a kind of compromise. This is what I mean by strategic public sector presence in banking. Finance is too important to be left entirely to the private sector. Some government presence in finance should be there. So decide on what qualifies as strategic public sector presence, 50, 45, 35%, over what time frame. And for now, in the foreseeable future, focus on reforms within public ownership. You may experiment with lowering government stakes below 50% and or privatization in select cases and watch the outcomes. So the long view, strategic presence of public sector should continue. How to go towards that, whether through limited privatization or expedited privatization, are the policy choices that we need to make. Thank you very much.